Shelby would have us believe that our identities are not so relevant to how we engage in struggles for justice, struggles for racial justice. But if identities are in fact the products of our efforts to overcome problems, then the content and consequences of our efforts impact the content of our character, right? The kinds of dispositions requisite for the kind of society both of us desire are in part formed in the context of political struggles. In other words, identities matter precisely because character and conduct are intimately interrelated and mutually dependent. What we do has everything to do with who we take ourselves to be. The problem then is with a certain view of collective identity, one in which Shelby puts forward and rightly distrusts. This view motivates political practices and justifies political choices on the basis, more often than not, of an already fixed conception of Black identity. But individual and collective identity, I believe, can be thought of differently. Black identities and the identities of those who struggle for racial justice are as much the products of principal struggle as they are the motivation for that struggle. Who we take ourselves to be, that is, how we understand ourselves as moral agents, often guides how we engage in politics and the sorts of choices we make, while engaging in politics fundamentally shape who we take ourselves to be. Identity talk matters then because of its ethical and moral implications for and beyond politics. Right? Now, Shelby also denies the moral philosopher laureate Lawrence Thomas's claim that genuine cooperation among Black folk or African Americans, I'm bringing it home, requires a group narrative that is, quote, a set of stories which defines values and entirely positive goals, which specifies a set of fixed points of historical significance, and which defines a set of ennobling rituals to be regularly performed. These narratives enable forms of mutual trust that inform solidaristic efforts to secure freedom and justice, according to Thomas. Shelby rejects this view on the grounds that genuine cooperation among Black folk is a rare occurrence in African American politics, and given that conceptions of African American politics that do not presuppose such cooperation should be sufficient. He also takes issue with the claim that mutual trust can only be formed through participation in group narratives. But these criticisms do not address what is truly at stake in the importance of storytelling to identity formation. We need not agree with the particulars of Thomas's position to agree with the claim that narrative is critical to character formation, that the kinds of stories we tell ourselves help orient us, habituate us even, to the world and to our fellows. Character formation should be a crucial component of political struggle. This is not, oftentimes progressives want to give up this kind of talk, right? And I think they're wrong to give it up, right? For a variety of reasons, right? But what I'm trying to suggest here is that, again, the kinds of stories we tell ourselves, right, ought to be a critical and crucial component of political struggle because it has everything to do with the kinds of persons that we are becoming. What does it mean to tell the story of the strange fruit dangling from poplar trees? If you don't know the reference, Billie Holiday and lynching. How is it that we tell ourselves a story of the violence, right, of American racism, of American racial apartheid? And how might that story constitute us in relation to our fellows in our pursuit of justice? What does it mean that we consistently want to repress it in terms of the kinds of persons that we hope to become? That is, when we don't want to look at the darkness that's deep inside our own souls to understand how deeply flawed and fragile and sinful, how capable we are of evil. And if we don't confront it, what does it do? It opens us up to hubris. It sanctions the illusion that we can be godlike. The stories that we tell ourselves have everything to do with the kinds of persons we hope to become. It's not simply enough to fight for justice. One must reflect that commitment in one's character. Otherwise, we end up with individuals like Robert Mugabe, right? Who fought in the name of justice but failed to exhibit it in his life. Right? That's when you get thugs who pimp in the name of freedom. Oh, I shouldn't have used that word. What I want to suggest then is that we think about Black identity in a truly pragmatic way, which insists on its importance for character formation and avoids the narrow racial essentialism that Shelby rightly seeks to avoid. I'll bring it to a close. I'll step away from this for a moment so you can see I'm making it up as I go.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you're faring well where you are, and if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. Now, I want to start with sharing with you an African proverb. It goes, when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. That is an African proverb. And there's a lot of meaning in that. Because the roots have gone so deep, the tree has a very firm foundation. Even when the wind, which symbolizes struggles, which symbolizes challenges, there's no need to worry that the tree will fall or the tree will bend. That is because the roots are very deep. Yes. And so, we are likening this tree to the African-American identity. Yeah? Identity is a crisis that I myself have personally witnessed with Black Americans. You see? African-American identity has always been tested by the winds of history, slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. We have a doctor by the name Eddie S. Glaude Jr. He explains through his philosophical lens that African-American identity is neither fragile nor fixed. It is a living, evolving force, constantly reshaped by the struggles and experiences of Black people in America. So this video, we are also going to unpack this speech that is going to be told by Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. We are going to unpack the paradoxes, the tensions, and the hidden structures within Glaude's framing, seeing African-American identity both as a burden and a source of strength, both imposed by society and reclaimed by the peoples themselves, right? Identity is a very big issue in America, particularly towards the marginalized communities. And you know, in this channel, we speak more about Black Americans. So we are going to listen to Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. Let's listen to him. I shall share with you my thoughts by the end of the video, of course, where we shall also have a deep, critical deconstruction. Yes. Thanks for watching, and let's dive in.
In the age of Obama, our rush to this notion that we have entered a post-racial utopia, it proceeds on the assumption that Obama must be rendered blank. In 1951, in an essay entitled Many Thousands Gone, James Baldwin, in effect, said that the price of our entry into the public domain is not to make the Black face white, but to make it blank. And to the extent to which the Negro's face has been washed away, our guilt will vanish. Part of what we need to understand Black identity to be about, right, is a certain way of orienting oneself to the world, registering a particular kind of understanding of the formation of the moral self in relation to a particular set of stories to which I owe fidelity, to which I ought to show some kind of pious orientation to, stories that make in some significant way me possible, and those stories have something to tell America. But part of the challenge involves thinking about Black identity in a way that's supple enough that we don't get fixed, that we don't become singularly obsessed, and we wind up like Antigone and Creon. One wanting to bury the brother no matter what cost, and one wanting to defend the state at no matter the cost. Both shuts down the ability to discriminate. Both kills the ability to make delicate distinctions. Both leads to a deformation of character. The choice that we have in front of us, the task that we have in front of us, is to imagine race and racial identity anew. The pragmatic view of black identity rests on two nodal points. First, language and black identities are descriptions of certain schemes of interaction that help us get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience. Let me say that again. Those of you who are taking notes, I saw it. Race, language, and black identities are descriptions of certain schemes of interaction that help us get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experiences. They're tools used in problem-solving activity. For example, race language is the best way of describing a certain form of policing. And there's no other way around it, which singles out black individuals for a particular kind of treatment. There's no better way of describing racial profiling unless certain folk are willing to give up the ability to describe such practices, then they have to concede that race language must remain in our conceptual toolbox. But this does not mean that all discussions of problems involving black folk are best conducted with race language. We must cultivate our ability to see that some problems are best described otherwise. Failure to do so narrows our political options and suggests a hardening of our individual capacity of discrimination, which too often blinds us to the uncertainty and conflict characteristic of any situation properly called moral. Such blindness inevitably affects our character. We can become obsessed with narrow notions of the race and denies the lessons of any view of tragedy. Second, black identity is in part a consequence of the kinds of stories we tell ourselves about our beliefs, choices, and actions in the context of problem-solving activity. I can't tolerate the idea that we no longer can tell our story. Oh, we need to tell our story so that America can understand itself more fully. When we decide that the use of race language is appropriate to describe a particular event, say like racial profiling, that event is made sense of against the background of other events that matter, like the historical tensions between police departments and black communities, the historic formation of police departments in relation to black communities. This background of things that matter shapes our characters and informs our conduct. It amounts to a reservoir of experiences that is indispensable to any effort to invade successfully the future. Such descriptions of the past discloses the impulses and habits formed in the context of experience that carry us one way or another. So the pragmatic view of thinking about black identity shifts the discussion in at least two ways. We move from the idea that notions of obligation and good are based in a conception of a fixed racial self to an idea of solidarity and identity formation in the face of particular problems. And two, this view evades the rather narrow debates about races, whether races are real or not. Right? There we find, and instead insist in some significant way, that we look the facts of racialized experiences in the United States squarely in the face. When we look those experiences squarely in the face, we find usually on the other side of the tracks, even in Wheaton, America's darker souls struggling to create themselves and to sing America. Right? What's striking is that the sound always has at its root a blue note, reflective of the limit conditions of the world of action and of an insistence to create and act anyway. To be sure, America's history of white supremacy has produced particularly charged conceptions of black identity and history. It could not be otherwise. But for those of us who struggle to imagine a politics in the age of Obama, a politics in the aftermath of the 60s revolution, because race and the idea of black identity and the extraordinary history they reference remain for us live hypotheses, it is necessary that we think about these issues more clearly. Once we do this, perhaps we can get on with the business of finding better ways of talking about the complexity of black lives and of responding intelligently to the actual problems we face. We live in a moment where our national pastime, I'm not talking about baseball, our national pastime, that is to say, as Ralph Ellison wrote in his 1970 essay, What Would America Be Like Without Blacks? That America's always entertained this fantasy that it could finally get shut of black people. The irony is that the occasion for its latest iteration is a black president. If we cannot fundamentally come to terms with the complexity of our moment and re-articulate, reconstruct the various ways in which race continues to overdetermine the life chances of so many of us, our national pathology will only deepen. The challenge, the charge is for us to think anew, to think creatively, to think imaginatively, to think pragmatically. Thank you. Now, I just bombarded you with a lot of stuff. I could have preached. I was thinking about taking it here, but I changed my mind. I still have time, and I can do it. We want to open it up for questions. And we could talk about a range of issues, not just simply the way in which I parse the question of the theme, created or crafted. In some ways, I view those as the same thing. Right? And so part of what I'm trying to suggest is that identities are not givens. Identities are made. And what's interesting is that we never come into the world upon a stage that we ourselves have built. We enter a world that is already, the stage has already been built, and then we find our feet on our own terms, right? So questions, comments, queries? Yes? Stand up and project. Go to the microphone. You don't have to, just say it. You can speak up, and I'll repeat it.
Since, I guess, as we were kind of talking about at the beginning, the definition of words, and when you use the word politics, it brings to mind a different image than I think you're trying to say about it. So, I guess, what is your definition?
Right. I do not mean by politics just simply electoral processes. Politics, for me, cuts across a range of spheres, right? Whether it's the private or the public domain, whether it's the social or cultural domain, right? It's where individuals, right, engage in a kind of interaction over the distribution of burdens and benefits. And that goes beyond just simply 2-year or 4-year election cycles. It also has something to do with my conception of democracy, which comes out of how I read the pragmatist tradition. And Dewey in particular doesn't reduce democracy to American institutions, right? He tries to disentangle democracy from liberalism. He tries to disentangle democracy from capitalism, and he tries to disentangle democracy from kind of institutional representations, institutions that emerge under particular circumstances. For him, democracy is a way of life. It's an ethical ideal towards which we strive, right? So democracy is never instantiated, right? He would say the best cure for the ills of democracy is what? More democracy, right? And so the idea is that you have this ideal that will guide and serve as the benchmark or serve as the measure of our relative failure or success in trying to reach goals to assure that everyday ordinary folk are living decently and able to not only dream dreams, but to achieve those dreams. To fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates, never thereafter to be a stranger. Bless you, bless you. Identity would seem to be the garment which one covers the nakedness of the self, in which case it is best that the garment be loose, a little like the robes of the desert, through which one's nakedness can always be felt and sometimes discerned. The trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes. One of the striking consequences of the tragedy of race in the United States has been the preoccupation with identity formation among African Americans. Because most African Americans entered this fragile experiment in democracy as chattel, as somebody else's belongings, the question of who they take themselves to be has been intimately connected to a political and social reality which denied them recognition. As such, African Americans historically stand in an uneasy relation to America, constantly faced with the choice, a tragic choice at times, of accepting America as home or rejecting the possibility of ever flourishing on these shores. Ironically, in the initial phases, this struggle over the issue of identity took place in the context of a country uneasy about its own identity in relation to Europe. We need only recall Ralph Waldo Emerson's words in his 1837 address, American Scholar, right? There he urged an adolescent nation to declare intellectual independence, to shake off its inferiority complex, and to forge a form of life reflected of the nation's distinctive landscape. Emerson powerfully declared in the opening lines of that address, quote, "Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close. The millions that around us are rushing into life cannot always be fed on the sere remains of foreign harvests. Events, actions arise that must be sung, that will sing themselves. Who can doubt that poetry will revive and lead in a new age as the star in the constellation Harp, which now flames in our zenith, astronomers announce, shall one day be the pole star for 1,000 years," end quote. Walt Whitman took himself to answer Emerson's call, and his poetry sung of America, yes? But African Americans were forced to create themselves amid the absurdity of a nation committed at once to freedom and unfreedom. Theirs was a blue note, an unstable chord which called attention to the unbridled chaos at the heart of American democracy. That African Americans have been, for the most part, successful in these attempts at self-creation is testimony to the enormous power of their creative energies. However, questions of Black identity still remain a central concern for us today. How should African Americans identify, understand themselves as individuals and as a group in relation to a nation that historically denied them recognition? What are we to make of this past in light of the successes of the civil rights movement and the expansion of a Black middle class? After all, I stand before you in a very nice suit, I think. Right? One thing to be sure is that the ideas of Black identity continue to animate the political choices of many African Americans, generating vexing concerns about the appropriateness of such ideas in efforts to secure justice in our democracy. And all of this is all the more complicated by the fact of President Obama's presidency, that Black body that's constantly interrupting us. Of course, a lot is at stake when we begin a discussion about racial identity of any sort in the United States, right? We question how people orient themselves in a constantly changing world. We worry about how individuals see themselves in relation to their fellows and find their place in a set of stories that binds them to similarly situated selves. Do they identify with others on the basis of blood, language, customs, and/or inheritance? We are horrified by the prospects that differences that really do not make a difference serve as the basis for exclusion and a lack of moral concern for others. We worry then about identities wrongly understood, about how they blind us to the central lesson that tragedy teaches, that crude reductions of the moral complexity of our moral lives often lead to an exclusive attachment of one value and a disregard for others. We become like Creon in Sophocles' Antigone, singularly obsessed. All right? Y'all all right? Just checking in on you. Now, I'm particularly interested in the ways Black identity in the United States continue to motivate political and ethical choices that shape our world. For such identity talk entails answers to who we as African Americans take ourselves to be, and how we orient ourselves to quote unquote others, how we conceive of our obligations to those whom we consider to be one of us, and what constitutes the good for us. We can translate all of that in terms of what does it mean to keep it real? What does it mean to be authentic? How are we to understand whether or not we hang out with the Black folk at the cafeteria table? What does it mean to self-segregate? What does it mean to think of ourselves as having some necessary obligation to those who look like us? Right? In other words, whether we know it or not, how we think about black identity affects how we understand notions of virtue, ideas of the right and the good in the context of this particular community of experience. That is to say, when persons act in the name of these identities, they often presume that their actions and dispositions form the basis of widespread approbation, that they are obligatory and legitimate, and that there is a supreme end that defines, for the most part, their desires and purposes. How we think about black identity matters, particularly when we hold the view that our beliefs about the world have ethical significance. It matters then if someone believes that there is an African culture that properly orients African-descended people throughout the world, or if another person believes that races are fictions, that they're not real. Both of these views wield a tremendous amount of influence in the U.S. Academy, but also in the arena of politics. So in this talk tonight, I want to critically examine a particular view of black identity, which assumes that notions of obligation to the race and the desires and purposes of African American individuals are derivative and dependent upon a view of who we take ourselves to be, independent of the choices we make. I got to read that sentence again. Now, remember, I began with a quotation from John Dewey. Y'all remember that quotation? Okay, somebody shook their head. It is proper to say, I'm glad you shook your head. See, y'all like, yeah, no, you don't remember that. It is proper to say that in choosing this object rather than that, one is in reality choosing what kind of person or self one is going to be, right? Remember that. That's the end of that quotation. The sentence that I just read, right? I want to critically examine a particular view of black identity, which assumes that notions of obligation to the race and the desires and purposes of African American individuals are derivative and dependent on a view of who we take ourselves to be, independent of the choices we make. I do this with an eye fixed intensely on the task of reconstructing the way many African Americans think of their ethical lives in relation to their political choices. The choices we make have everything to do with who we take ourselves to be. Not just simply who we take ourselves to be dictating our choices. I'm flipping it in a way. Does that make sense? And this is the kind of pragmatic move that I want to explore. Now, I maintain that notions of virtue, I don't know why I did that, right and good, flow, as John Dewey says, from independent springs, such that each has an equally legitimate basis and can pull us in different and sometimes conflicting directions. This makes moral decision a real problem and gives ethical judgment and moral discernment their vitality. It's not just simply a matter of knowing what's right and wrong, the difference between right and wrong. That's pretty straightforward, right? It's oftentimes, that's not really a kind of dilemma. You just have to convince yourself to do wrong because you already know what wrong is. Really, the kind of moral dilemma rests when you have a conflict of goods, right? That is to say, I desire this as good, but I have this as my duty, right? Sartre's no exit, right? And Pierre, do I stay home and take care of my sick mother, or do I go and fight in the resistance, right? The moral life is much more complex than just simply right and wrong, right? It's the fact that the good, the right, the virtuous collide. My claim points to the tragic dimensions of the world of action, that we often find ourselves confronted with competing goods as we act. It also locates the notion of character development and moral progress in our ability to make delicate distinctions in the face of the precariousness of a world in which doubt and the need for choice impinge at every turn. Our moral decisions are not settled by reference to some fixed and unchanging racial identity. That would deny the implications of the contingency of our moral lives. Instead, it turns out, and that was a very controversial claim, by the way, that we can talk about. Instead, it turns out that our individual and collective identities are in part a consequence of our moral decisions. My concern here is not whether races are real or not, or whether races are objectively true or false. Reality for me is a denotative term. It designates everything that happens. Lies for me are as real as trees, right? If you don't believe me, just give me your money. Okay, give me your $5 bill. If you don't think a $5 bill is real, give it to me. It's just paper with ink on it, right? But that's a different kind of argument. Arguments that claim that races are not real because they're predicated on false notions are arguments that conclude that black identities are incoherent because they are based on such false notions. Those sorts of arguments do not move me very much. I'm more concerned with social practices, within which race talk matters deeply. But even if you disagree with my naive realism, I invoked that phrase to the president today. One can certainly talk about utterances that involve race language without taking as our major concern the truth or falsity of the utterances. Our concern, for example, may involve the appropriateness or correctness of such language use. And an utterance can be true and inappropriate, right? For my purposes, then, the issue of whether races are real or not is beside the point, because my principal concern lies with the practices that constitute the use of a shared language. I'm not suggesting here that the objective status of races isn't an interesting question, simply that it is not the only question when we take up matters of race. I'm also not interested in defending what many folk call an essentialist conception of race or black identity. Talk of racial essences are at best bad ways of talking about particular experiences, or at worst misguided quests for certainty that aim to secure us from the contingency that is an inherent part of our lives. My hope is to offer a pragmatic way of thinking about black identity, which evades these narrow options and takes seriously the problem-solving activity that is an intrinsic part of what it means to be a moral agent. The emphasis then is on our capacity as black individuals to judge the respective claims of duty and desire as they arise in concrete experience, understanding that in some cases they may indeed conflict. Black identity talk remains. We simply should not overextend its reach. Let me translate for a moment. Part of what I'm up to in this particular talk is to kind of resist the notion that to embrace black identity is to define the sorts of choices that I make. That African-American moral lives, right, are rendered intelligible in some significant way by the fact of their blackness, right? And part of what I want to do is to kind of expose the complexity of what it means to embrace the notion of black identity, of embracing a black identity in the context of a world that's organized along racist assumptions, right? To give attention to that complexity without reducing it to some essentialized notion. Right? What does it mean to just simply say, black folk are complex people too? Right? And how can we think about this in a way without giving short shrift to the historical significance of what it means to embrace a notion of blackness? So, for example, when someone utters a sentence like this, I'm an African American, in the context of a debate about public policy, or my view, she's not disclosing for all to see something that was previously internal. Instead, her words orient those around her, for better or worse, in a particular kind of way. They understand that for her, when it comes to this particular topic, another set of issues must be taken into account. The late Richard Rorty makes the point best, in my view. He writes, such sentences are not used to report events going on within the Cartesian theater, which is a person's consciousness. They are simply tools for coordinating our behavior with those of others. This is not to say that one can reduce mental states such as beliefs and desires to physiological or behavioral states. It is merely to say that there is no point in asking whether a belief represents reality, either mental reality or physical reality, accurately. That is, for the pragmatist, not only a bad question, but the root of much wasted philosophical energy. The question, then, is not whether our beliefs about race and racial identities represent reality, but for what purposes would it be useful to hold such beliefs and to invoke them as crucial aspects of who we take ourselves to be. Now, there are two ways, at least in this talk, of understanding black identity. One I want to call an archaeological approach, and the other is a kind of pragmatic historicist approach. Both, I think, focus on the ethical dimensions of black identity. Obviously, I want to put forward the view that the pragmatist approach best enables us to understand the complex ethical choices that attend any talk of black identity. In the end, I want to suggest that we have approached the issue of black identity from the wrong direction. It's not simply a question of who we are and the answer determines how we act in the world. Rather, the choices we make in the face of problems and meddlesome circumstances turn out to be our lives, requiring of us the continued cultivation of our ability to make delicate distinctions. So, to think about black identity in the archaeological way, right? Let's talk about that really quickly. We can think of black identity in terms of a specific form of life, which binds a group of individuals to one another, a sort of collective true self, right? This form of life is distinct from other people's, perhaps different in its conception of knowledge, right, in its understanding of beauty, as well as in its formulation of the moral and ethical norms that ought to guide action in the world. On this view, black identity reflects the common historical experiences and shared vocabularies which provide us as one people with stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning beneath the shifting divisions and vicissitudes of our actual history. This singularity or oneness is the essence of the people and constitutive of who we are as individuals. Now, the political theorist and now president of the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutmann, describes this view as that of a cultural identity group, right? On this view, culture represents a way of life that is comprehensive in that it constitutes and constrains the identities and therefore the lives of its members by providing them with a common language, history, institutions of socialization, range of occupations, history and lifestyles, distinctive literary and artistic traditions, architectural styles, music, dress, and whatnot. Gutmann does not include African Americans in this category. She reserves the majority of her description of us for a chapter on processes of ascription. I suspect black folk are not considered examples of a cultural group for her because they do not, or we do not, occupy a distinctive territory. But part of the interesting challenge of black identity talk is that it is complexly articulated. It may involve a racial dimension, a cultural or political dimension, depending on the ends to which it is invoked. When articulated, for example, as a particular form of black nationalist politics, black identity talk is much like the cultural identity group Gutmann talks about. The black nation provides the boundaries within which we think of our political ambitions, right? Territorial or cultural sovereignty, for example. Y'all all right? Okay, you following me? Well, if not, I'll bring it home, right? Who we are and how we understand our relation to others, and perhaps most important, how we understand our obligations to one another. Here, on this black nation thesis, here the notions of good and obligation proceed out of our understanding of the racial self. In other words, black identities and the culture out of which they take shape provide a comprehensive context out of which its members make choices. I want to focus this by reference to a historical example really quickly. Cultural nationalists of various sorts in the era of black power, right, argued that there is a specific cultural inheritance for African Americans. We are African, they argued, right? We have a value system that, in spite of the perceived rupture of the transatlantic slave trade, continues to distinguish us from Europeans and animate our present-day choices. I mean, Kwanzaa, for example, is an outgrowth of this particular position, right? Those of you who celebrate Kwanzaa didn't know you were all black nationalists, did you, right? If these values, in fact, fail, at least consciously, to inform our actions, such a state of affairs only indicates the effects of white supremacy. We simply, on this view, have been robbed of our cultural inheritance. In light of this, our aim should be to reconstruct as best as possible a form of life that reflects the true way of being African in the world. So Maulana Karenga, the founder of the US organization, developed an elaborate cultural theory of blackness, what he called Kawaida theory, designed to reorient African people in the United States. Through a complex set of ritual practices, i.e. Kwanzaa, Karenga argued that African Americans could reconnect with their past, with the proper way of being African in the world, and this reconnection would then facilitate a healthier relationship with others and a more revolutionary politics. Karenga's view was only one expression of a general position which informed most of the various political projects of the period. Many believed that African American freedom required a revolution of black minds, right? Black individuals needed to remove the psychological chains of white supremacy and embrace a black national consciousness which reflected a more authentic way of being in the world. A world, as Karenga was fond of saying, in which blackness would become our ultimate reality. Blackness would become our ultimate reality. Tillich wouldn't like that, would he? Y'all didn't get that, Joe. Right, but anyway, this position assumed what can be called an expressivist conception of the racial self. For Karenga and many others, African Americans were self-determining agents, primarily because there was something unique about them as black people. This uniqueness determined their relation with others and defined their obligation to the race. If a black individual failed to connect with this inner something, and with those similarly situated, she would fail, in effect, to live the life that is uniquely hers. Uncle Tom, sellout, race traitor, right? The same goes for African Americans in general. If black people in the United States fail to embrace their cultural inheritance, their unique form of life, then they would fail to live in a way that is truly theirs. The task then is to discover, under the rubble left in the wake of white supremacy, who we are and give voice to an authentic politics in which blackness is the controlling metaphor. Now, we can talk about this, trace this all the way back to Martin Delany and others in the 19th century. So let's call this the archaeological approach. Here, black identity is about discovery. An archaeological project in which we uncover our true selves and infer from that discovery what we must do. Black identity is interpreted here in terms of reality and appearance. There's a real way of being black and a false way. Hence, keeping it real, Oreo. What's the new ones these days? I don't know. Y'all don't use those words at Wheaton. Okay. Right. There's a real way of being black and a false way. Something out there is essentially black. And when we lose our way on this archaeological approach, as some of us have as a result of white supremacy, we need only find it and all will be well. Now, I should not be too glib. The impulse for this approach has its roots in the devastating effects of white supremacy. Frantz Fanon, writing in the context of colonial struggles, located the reasons for this approach in the passionate research directed by the secret hope, quote, of discovering beyond the misery of today, beyond self-contempt, resignation, and abjuration, some very splendid and beautiful era whose existence rehabilitates us, both in regards to ourselves and others, end quote. The psychological need for archaeological projects that reconstruct monumental histories, then, is part of an effort to respond to collective humiliation. It is a lashing back and a refusal to accept certain conditions of living. It so happens that the conception of the self informing these projects is often fixed and unchanging as a reference for deliberation. With this in mind, listen, it is not really possible to have genuine conflict or uncertainty about how one should act as a black person. The distinction is made beforehand. Either one acts like a true black person, one who understands who she is, or one doesn't. The conflict is only apparent. The problem arises, of course, when individuals or groups postulate one single factor, the racial self, as an explanation of the moral lives of black people. The moral complexity and the uncertainty that is often part of a political decision, the moral complexity and uncertainty that is often a part of political decision-making in particular is reduced to a simple conflict between showing fidelity to one's cultural inheritance or not, keeping it real or not. Such a way of rendering complex moral situations in which race is actually involved only indicates the loss of the capacity of discrimination, of an ability to make delicate distinctions. Under such conditions, no matter what the problems may involve, they may involve issues of gender, they may involve issues of class, sexuality, religious preference, geographical difference, or simply the difficulties of falling in and out of love. All problematic situations can be resolved by an appeal to the good and to note the notions of obligation that flow from being authentically black in the world. The moral choices of African Americans are narrowed in such a way that the actual uncertainty and conflict that is characteristic of any situation properly called moral is obscured. The fact that we are often ignorant of the end and of good consequences, of the right and just approach, of the direction of virtuous conduct when we address the complicated issues of race and racism in this country is lost. Moreover, our individuality is compromised as this idea of black identity goes imperial, as Kwame Anthony Appiah, my colleague, rightly worries, and implicates itself in cases where judgments and choices have been made. Judgment and choices have to be made in light of the particular forces that impinge upon us at the time. Now, I see that your eyes are glazing over. Y'all, so what I'm trying to do is to say, right, that this archaeological approach presumes some kind of fixed racial self, right, that we can retreat to that settles the moral complexity of our lives. And that seems to me wrong. But I don't want to rush to the notion or to the idea that black identity is no longer useful, that somehow it has little to do with how we orient ourselves in the world. Because the typical response to this view has been to deconstruct race, right? Claim that the notion is an arbitrary social construct. We heard that phrase in the introduction, right? And problematize the way we think about racial identity. Oh, you're just a human being. You're like, right? Oh, you're just like everybody else. And who's everybody else? White folks. Right? I know, yeah, some people say that's racist. No, it isn't. I'm just being funny, right? The typical response, so by now we've become familiar with some of the arguments that follow from such a position. We should focus on real forces like the operations of capital, right? And not on ideological notions like race. Or goods and services should be distributed on the basis of merit, not on the basis of racial identity. And perhaps the most widely held, that our belief in race is a necessary condition for the existence of racism, right? You've heard this argument, right? That our belief in race is a necessary condition for the existence of racism, and that getting rid of race language will help us end racism once and for all, right? As if race talk always singles out, right, the deficient, the pathological, in interesting sorts of ways, right? In short, in the admirable efforts to break loose from the stranglehold of bad ways of thinking about race and black identity, many critics simply swing the pendulum in the opposite direction and have never quite, at least to my mind, provided an adequate argument for such a drastic move. I would only suggest that to avoid this problem, some of the problematic consequences of this conclusion, we must realize that black identity has been and can be thought of in different ways, that our moral lives as black individuals are not reducible to one single explanatory principle, the racial self, and most importantly, that race language and racial identities are, at bottom, suggestions about the terms in which deliberations about particular moral questions are best conducted. Remember the Rorty quotation, right? So the pragmatic view of identity does not hold that identity is about discovery. Rather, identities are seen as consequences of human activity. More specifically, identities are the products of our actions as we struggle to resolve problematic situations, dispose of meddlesome circumstances, and surmount obstacles. Identity is not an archaeological project in which we uncover our true selves and infer from that what we must do. Instead, taken together, our problem-solving activity turns out to be our lives. In this view, character and conduct are interrelated and mutually dependent as we act in particular situations. Remember, the self is not some stable, unchanging, continuous frame of reference. Rather, it is thought of as an organization of habits that is relatively stable and enduring. These habits that are always subject to modification when we act constitute our character as it was formed, at least in part from previous experiences. Or as John Dewey writes, quote, character is the interpenetration of habits. I love that definition. Character is the interpenetration of habits. If each habit existed in an insulated compartment, right, and operated without affecting or being affected by others, character would not exist. As such, no self stands still, right? The country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, right, is not the same man who's standing here, right? It is constantly, for better or worse, becoming, right? Sounds a lot like Emerson, or maybe Nietzsche, depending upon your temperament, right? No self stands still. It is constantly becoming. And, quote, it is in the quality of that becoming. It is in the quality of that becoming that virtue resides, end quote. Moreover, our understanding of the beliefs and choices and actions that rely on these habitual tendencies arises in the context of bringing those experiences to consciousness in narrative. The story of the self, the history that we tell of our formation. So what we've done and are doing and the stories we weave about those experiences are absolutely critical for a pragmatic view of Black identity. Now, I don't want, a good friend of mine, Tommy Shelby, he's at Harvard. Y'all all right? Just checking on you. Are y'all just being nice? Are you okay, for real? Okay. A good friend of mine, Tommy Shelby, I don't want to make the argument he makes in We Who Are Dark, right? I don't want to deny the relevance of this or centrality of Black identity to Black political struggle. I still think there's a role for it. Shelby argues for a position he calls pragmatic Black nationalism, which for him is this view that Black solidarity is merely a contingent strategy for creating freedom and social equality for Black folk, a pragmatic yet principled approach to achieve racial justice. But in making the argument, he rejects the standard claim that African-American politics requires a notion of collective identity. He notes that such views often result in a reification of race and a conception of Black life that obscures relevant differences among Black folk and frustrates individual freedom. I'm not quite sure that Shelby takes seriously what a pragmatic view of Black identity might suggest. I think for him, the term pragmatic seems to have only heuristic value and not to refer to a set of philosophical commitments. We need not, in my view, discard identity talk as such. We simply should reconstruct the term in light of our pragmatic commitments.
So, after listening to Dr. Eddie Glaude, here is my deep critical deconstruction and rather a deep critical analysis. Yes. So Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. situates African American identity within the tradition of pragmatism, a philosophy that resists absolutes, right, and insists on the dynamics of truth and meaning. You see, in this speech, Dr. Glaude argues that identity is not static, but an ongoing process, made and remade through lived experiences. He also adds that what reshapes and shapes American identity is having a collective memory and also the shared struggles. For Black Americans, or rather this pragmatic insight is very crucial. You see, the identity of Black American has always been contested, right? It has been reduced by white supremacy to stereotypes of inferiority, criminality, or invisibility. Yet, African American identity cannot be confined to the oppressive gaze of others. It constantly reinvents itself through art, music, resistance, and the ongoing demand for recognition. Dr. Glaude destabilizes the binary opposition of white versus black identity. Dr. Glaude shows that African American identity emerges not as a passive reaction to whiteness, but as an independent creation. However, the paradox remains. Black identity in America cannot fully escape the context of racial subjugation. It is forged against the weight of history, but it also transcends it. Another thing that Dr. Glaude touched on was the burden and the beauty of black identity. So it's both yin and yang, black and white, good and bad, happiness and sadness. So one of the most striking tension in Glaude's thought is the dual nature of African American identity. It is both a burden and a source of beauty. The burden comes from the collective memory of slavery, Jim Crow laws, and the contemporary systemic and individual racism happening in the United States of America. To be black in America, Dr. Glaude suggests, is to inherit the wounds of history. Yet, simultaneously, African American identity is a reservoir of creativity and strength. Here is where we have things like jazz, gospel, hip-hop, African American literature, and African American oral tradition, which shows how Black Americans have turned suffering into expression, transforming pain into artistry and solidarity. This speech allows us to see this duality not as a contradiction, but as an interplay. The very wound gives rise to the beauty. The oppression that was meant to erase African American humanity becomes the soil from which a rich cultural identity bloomed. Thus, identity is not a singular essence, but a negotiation between trauma and triumph. The third thing that Dr. Glaude touched on was identity as a political and ethical task. For Glaude, African American identity is not merely cultural or personal. It is political. To claim black identity in America is to resist erasure and to challenge systems of injustice. Through a pragmatic lens, identity becomes an ethical practice, something one enacts through choices and commitments. Being African American means carrying the responsibility to confront racism, to affirm dignity, and to fight for a more just future. Yet, here lies another deconstructive tension, right? Identity is both personal and collective. The individual black person carries the freedom of to shape their life, but they are also bound to the collective narrative of African American struggle. One cannot fully separate personal identity from historical memory, right? This critical analysis reveals this paradox as central. African American identity is always caught between individuality and solidarity, right? The fourth instance, or the fourth point that Dr. Glaude touches on, is the unfinished character of African American identity. Pragmatism, as Dr. Glaude applies it, insists that no identity is final. African American identity, then, is always unfinished, always becoming. Each generation of Black American adds new meaning and interpretation to what it means to be Black in the US. From Frederick Douglass in the United States, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Toni Morrison, right? And today's activists of Black Lives Matter. Each moment rearticulates African American identity in new ways, right? So Dr. Glaude teaches us to be suspicious of final definitions. If we say African American identity is resilience, we must also acknowledge the vulnerability. If we say it is rooted in struggle, we must also admit it contains joy and celebration. Every attempt to define Black identity is already undermined by its multiplicity and fluidity. In this sense, African American identity mirrors America itself, unfinished, conflicted, striving, and never a whole, right? The fifth point that Dr. Glaude Anderson talks of is the African American identity as a mirror for America, right? Dr. Glaude often emphasizes that how America treats its black citizen reflects the moral core of the nation itself. African American identity, therefore, is not only about black people. It exposes the contradiction of American democracy. The United States claims ideals of freedom and equality, but African American experiences reveals the hypocrisies within those claims. Through a deconstructive and a critical analysis, we see through these speeches, such as the ones which black Americans make. We have Joy DeGray, we have Kimberly, we have Soldier, Sister Soldier, all, name them all. Dr. Glaude, name them all, right? They speak what is important. We see through their speeches, we see African Americans' identity as a mirror, a reflection of America's highest aspirations, right? A reflection of America's mightiest aspiration and its deepest failures. To wrestle with black identity is to wrestle with the soul of America. The unresolved struggle for equality among African Americans is therefore not just a black issue, but a national test of the country's democratic integrity, right? To conclude, we can say that, remember I started with an African proverb about the tree and the roots. You see, when the tree has deep roots, deep enough, we don't need to be worried about the wind. The roots symbolizes the African American identity, and the tree is the African Americans. So if we are deeply rooted, the challenges might come and go without breaking us, without making us go extinct, right? Wind is always guaranteed, but what is important is to have deep roots. You see, if you don't know yourself, chances of becoming who you are not are always extremely very high, right? That's why having an identity is very, very crucial, particularly to the African Americans. So here's my conclusion, good people. The African proverb that I said reminds us that when the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind. African American identity, through Eddie Glaude's pragmatic framing, has deep roots in history, memory, and culture. It bends with the winds of oppression, but does not break. By deconstructing his ideas, we black people uncover the paradoxes within, identity as a burden and a beauty, as personal and collective, as rooted yet unfinished. African American identity is not a fixed label. It is a living process, a continuous negotiation within the past and aspiration towards the future. To embrace it is to affirm life, dignity, and possibility in the face of enduring struggle. It is to claim, as Dr. Glaude insists, that black identity is not simply about survival, but about shaping a more expansive vision of democracy itself. Yes. Guys, that is my deep critical analysis, as I promised you. And if you have any thoughts, if you have more to add or something to take away from this, please do so on the comment section. I will be glad to hear from you, listen to your thoughts. Let's continue this discussion about African American identity in the comment section. If you like also what I do, you may want to subscribe to the channel. You may also want to support me on Patreon. Donate something on my Patreon. I'll surely appreciate. Yes. Thank you for watching, guys. God bless you, and see you in the next one.